Hey, glad you're back at Pocket Roni. We're going to be factoring trinomials still, but now we're going to have positive and negative signs in our trinomial. We are not in a positive world anymore. We're going to have some negative signs. I have broken these problems down into 3 different types. So right now we're going to be looking at type 1. Type 1 has a negative sign in your first spot and a positive sign in the last spot. Okay, so I've labeled these as type 1. Let's look at 23b6. Okay, the first thing we always look for is, can we factor something out of all the numbers? This is a 1, 4, and 3. We cannot factor anything out, so we are ready to go to 2 parentheses. The next thing I do is look at my signs. I have a negative and a positive. Okay, the way that I get this last number is from multiplying my last 2 spots. Okay, so what are some ways that I get a positive? I can multiply a positive times a positive gives me a positive, but also multiplying a negative times a negative gives me a positive. If both of these had negative signs in these last numbers, a negative times a negative would give me a positive number. So just don't forget that a negative times a negative also gives you a positive. Okay? So now looking at the factors of x squared, my only factors of x squared are x times x, so this needs to be x and x. And then we look at the factors of 3. There's only one set, 3 times 1. Since these are both negative signs, it doesn't matter where your 3 and 1 go because they're both negative. Now let's multiply it back out, FOIL it back out just to double check yourselves. X times x, x squared. X times a negative 1, negative 1x. Negative 3 times an x is a negative 3x. And a negative 3 times a negative 1 is a positive 3. And then combining your x terms does give you a negative 4x. So that gives you the original problem, which tells you that those are the factors of that trinomial. Okay, let's look down at 23b10. Again, we're doing the same type. We have a negative sign in the first spot, a positive sign in the last spot. First, look to see, can you factor anything out of your numbers? No, you cannot. So you're ready to go straight to 2 parentheses. The next thing I look at is my signs. I have a negative here and a positive here. Since this is a negative, that tells me that they are both going to be negative, because multiplying these last 2 terms, when I multiply the last times the last, when I FOIL, first, outside, inside, last. When I do the last, I have a negative times a negative, and a negative times a negative gives me that positive sign right there. So now I'm ready to look at my factors. The only factors for x are x times x, so I know this is an x and this is an x. Now I'm looking at the factors of 24. So I have 24 times 1, 12 times 2, 6 times 4, 8 times 3. Since I don't have a coefficient here, and these are both negatives, when I do my outside-inside terms, I'll be adding my 2 negatives. I'll be in debt and then in debt again. So I can look at these and see which add to 11 to give you, because this, let's see. Let me show you. If I had 8 and 3, you see 8 and 3 add up to 11. But we're going to have a negative 8 and a negative 3. Negative 8 in debt or more in debt 3. You can always put in your other factors and test those and then FOIL it out. And if it doesn't work, then you know that those factors don't work. Okay? But looking at 8 and 3, I will show you how when these signs are the same, you can only when these signs are the same. If they're both positive, you can add these. When they're both negative, you can add the factors to give you that middle term. Only when both signs are the same. Okay? That should be a 3. Since these are both negatives, it doesn't matter which spot they're in. So FOILing it back out, I'll get x squared, my outside terms, negative 3x, inside a negative 8 times x, negative 8x. Last terms, a negative 8 times a negative 3 is a positive 24. Adding my x terms, I've got negative 3x, I'm in debt 3, I'm in debt 8 more, so I'm in debt 11x. And that shows me that that checks, which tells me this is the factors of that trinomial. Let's move down to 23E7. We're still in the same type. We have a negative here and a positive here. The difference is we have a coefficient. I look to see, can I factor anything out first? 3, 10, and 7, there's nothing I can factor out. So I'm ready to go straight to 2 parentheses. The fact that I have a negative here and a positive here tells me I need both of them to be a negative, because my multiplying my last terms, a negative times a negative, gives me a positive. Okay? So now I'm ready to look at the factors for 3, 3x times 1x. My factors for 7 are 7 times 1. They each only have one set of factors. So I'm going to start with my x squared, so 3x and 1x. Now I've got to look at my 7 and 1. It is going to matter on which place it goes. I need to look to see if my 7 goes first or goes second. Okay? So if I place it second, when I do my outside inside, this is going to give me a 3x times a negative 7 gives me a negative 21. That will give me a negative 1. A negative 21, a negative 21x minus a 1x is not going to give me my negative 10x. So that tells me that that's not going to work. Okay? So therefore I'm going to switch the places, put my 7 here, my 1 here. So now let's FOIL it out. 3x times 1x is 3x squared. 3x times a negative 1 is negative 3x. Negative 7 times a 1x is negative 7x. And a negative times a negative is a positive 7. Combining my x terms, a negative 3x and a negative 7x, I'm in debt 3, in debt 7 more. Now I'm in debt 10, and then a positive 7. That gives me the original problem, so that tells me that this is the factors that we're looking for. Alright, now we're going to be factoring type 2 problems. We're looking at 23B11. Type 2 is when you have a positive sign in the first spot and a negative sign in your last spot. Okay? Again, the first thing we look for is, can we factor anything out of all the numbers? We can't. So we're ready to factor to 2 parentheses. Okay? Remember, how do we get this last number? We get this last number by multiplying the last spots. Okay? The last in FOIL, first goes to your first number in the trinomial, last goes to the last number in the trinomial. Okay? So we multiply these last spots. Well, we have a negative number. How do you get a negative number? The only way to get a negative number is to multiply a positive times a negative, which tells me one of these has to be a positive and one of these numbers has to be a negative, because a positive times a negative gives you a negative. Okay? Since we have 2 different signs now, we have to be careful where we put our numbers, because this number will be positive and this number will be negative. And so when we have our outside inside terms and we're adding those together, you're adding a positive and negative now. Okay? So now we go back to looking at the factors of x squared. The only factors of x squared, x times x. So x, x. These are both positive, so it doesn't matter. X times x is x squared. Now we want the factors of 3. The only factors of 3 are 3 times 1. It does make a difference where the 3 and the 1 go. We want a positive 2 here. Okay? So since we want a positive 2, when you add a 3 and a 1, you want a positive number, which means our larger number has to be the positive value. Okay? So if we put the positive 3 here and make the 1 a negative, when you multiply it out, you have your x squared. Outside, x times negative 1 gives you a negative 1x. Inside, positive 3 times x gives you a positive 3x. Last, a positive 3 times a negative 1 gives you a negative 3. Combining your middle terms, you have a positive 3x and a negative 1x, which gives you a positive 2x. Okay? Off to the side, I'm going to show you what it would be like if you put your 3 and the 1 in the wrong spot. If you had x plus 1 and x minus 3, if I moved the spots of them, then I would have x squared, and that x times a negative 3x, positive 1 times x, and then I would still get a negative 3. Combining these terms, I would end up getting a negative 2x. That's not my middle term. I need to have a positive 2x. So it's very important of where you place your numbers with which sign. Okay? Let's move on down to 23b12. Remember, the first thing we look for is, can we factor out a number out of each one? I cannot factor anything out of here, so I'm ready to go straight to 2 parentheses. The next thing that I look for is my signs. I have a positive and a negative. Okay? My last term is negative. The last term comes from multiplying these last two numbers. Since that I need a negative, it means one needs to be positive and one needs to be negative, because a positive times a negative gives me a negative. Okay? Now I'm ready to factor. Factors of x squared are just x times x. So 1x here, x here. My factors of 18. 18 times 1, 9 times 2, 6 times 3. So I need to look. I'm going to have a negative number adding a positive number. Okay? So I have to look at these to decide. One will be negative and one will be positive, and it will give me this. So if one factor is negative and one is positive, it means you're subtracting them. You're subtracting those factors to get this middle term. Okay? Subtracting these factors, you see that subtracting a 6 and a 3 gives you 3. But you have to determine which one is going to be positive and which one is going to be negative. Since this is a positive number, my larger number needs to be the positive with the positive sign. Okay? Again, if you can't follow the little hints and tips I'm giving you as far as the factors, you can always pick a factor, put it in here, FOIL it out. If it doesn't give you this, then it's not the right factors. Okay? But this little tip, when your signs are different and you do not have a coefficient here, when your signs are different, you can subtract these factors to find your middle term. Okay? My 3 is positive, therefore the larger number needs to be with the positive sign. So I put my 6 here, my 3 here. I'm going to FOIL it back out. First, x squared. Outside, x times a negative 3, negative 3x. Inside, positive 6 times x, positive 6x. Last, positive times a negative is a negative 18. Combining my middle terms, a negative 3x and a positive 6x is a positive 3x, which gives me my original problem. This tells me this is the correct answer. Okay, let's go down to 23b15. Now we do have a coefficient in front, but I still have a positive and a negative. Okay? I look to see, can I factor anything out? Between a 5, 9, and 2, there is nothing that I can factor out. So I'm ready just to go straight to 2 parentheses. I look at my signs. I see that I have a negative here. The only way I can get a negative here is when I multiply these two numbers together. One has to be positive and one has to be negative. A positive times a negative gives me a negative, which means one has to be positive and one has to be negative. Okay? Now I'm looking at my factors. Factors of 5x squared are only 5x times 1x. That's the only set of factors. Now look at my factors of 2. 2 times 1. Yay, I only have one set of factors for each, but I have to get everything in the right spot. Okay? I'm going to start with my 5x squared, which means I need a 5x and a 1x. Now I'm looking at 2 and 1, but I have to get everything in the right place because I have positive and negative signs. Okay? So let's just say I put the 2 here and the 1 here. I'm going to multiply that out. There's no quick, easy tips for this. It's just trial and error. Let's FOIL it back out. 5x times 1x gives me a 5x squared. My outside terms, a 5x times a negative 2 gives me a negative 10x. My positive 1 times x is a positive 1x. My positive 1 times a negative 2 is negative 2. My inside terms, a negative 10x and a positive 1 gives me a negative 9x. That is not the same as a positive 9x, so therefore what I have tried does not work. So let's switch the places, put the 2 here and the 1 here. My first term will still be 5x squared. Outside, 5 times a negative 1, negative 5x. Positive 2 times a positive 1, positive 2x. Okay, a negative 5x plus 2x is going to give me a negative 3x. So what I have here doesn't work either. Do you see how it's just trial and error? Okay, I'm going to switch my signs. Okay, so your positive doesn't always have to be first, and then your negative second. Alright, so let's put my 2 and 1 back to where they were. This gave me a 5x times a negative 2 gave me a negative 10x. I actually need a positive 10x. So what if I made that a positive and then made this a negative? Okay, then I get a 5x times a positive 2, which gives me a positive 10x, and then a negative 1 times a 1x, which gives me a negative 1x. Now negative 1 times a positive 2, negative 2. So now if I combine my middle terms, a positive 10x and a negative 1 will give me a positive 9 and a negative 2. So don't give up on these, okay? Keep trying different things just as I did until you can FOIL it out and get your original answer, okay? Just keep trying, moving things around, moving your numbers, moving your signs. Okay, now we're doing type 3. We're going to look at 23D7. What I call type 3 problems is where you have a negative and a negative. Both places have a negative sign, okay? The first thing we look at is, can we factor anything out of all the numbers? And we cannot. So we're ready to go to 2 parentheses. We look at our signs, a negative and a negative, okay? Anytime this last spot is a negative, remember the last number comes from multiplying these last numbers. The only way to get a negative at the end of the trinomial is when you are multiplying a positive times a negative, okay? So, which tells me one has to be a positive, one has to be a negative. A positive times a negative is a negative, okay? Now we're looking at the factors. X times x gives you an x squared. Factors of 3 are 3 and 1. But we want our middle term to be a negative, okay? Do you see how I subtract these? 3 minus 1 is 2. But in order for the 2 to be negative, my larger number has to be negative. A negative 3 and a 1 is a negative 2. So when this is a negative, your larger number of your factors will have the negative sign. So that tells me my 3 needs to go with my negative sign. 3 needs to go with negative here and my 1 here. Let's FOIL it back out just to check. FOILing it back out. First, x squared. Outside, negative 3x. Inside, a positive 1x. And last is a negative 3. So therefore, my middle terms does give me a negative 2x. And I get what I started with. Okay, let's go down to 23D9. Can I factor anything out first? No. So I'm ready to go to 2 parentheses. I look at my signs, a negative, negative. Okay? Negative in the last spot always tells me one will be positive and one will be negative, because a positive times a negative is a negative, okay? Now look at my factors for x squared, x, x. Factors of 6. 6 times 1, 3 times 2. Remember, one's going to be positive and one's going to be negative, which tells me I basically can subtract them. But since this needs to be negative, my larger number takes on the negative sign. Subtracting 6 and 1 gives me a 5. That's not my middle term. Subtracting 3 and 2 gives me a 1. So that's the one that I want to use. I want to use that set of factors. But this needs to be a negative, which tells me my larger number needs to take on the negative sign. A negative 3 and a positive 2 gives me a negative 1. Okay? So let's make our 3 negative and our 2 positive. FOILing it out. X times x, x squared. X times a negative 3, negative 3x. Positive 2 times x, positive 2x. Positive 2 times negative 3, negative 6. Don't put negative 5, multiply there. Combining your middle terms, your x's, a negative 3 and a positive 2 gives me a negative 1x. And that does check. So that tells me that this is the factors. Let's look at 23C1. First thing I want to do is Can I factor any numbers out? No, I can't. So I'm ready to go straight to 2 parentheses. I look at my signs, they're both negatives. When this last number is a negative, it tells me that my parentheses will always be a positive and a negative, because a positive times a negative is a negative. Okay? Now look at my factors of x. X times x. Factors of 10. 10 and 1, 5 and 2. Okay? Since 1 is a positive and 1 is a negative, I will be subtracting. This only works when you have a coefficient of 1 right here. So 1's a positive, 1's a negative, which means you're subtracting them. The factors that subtract out to give you a 3 is 5 and 2. 5 minus 2 is 3. 1's going to be a positive and 1's a negative. I want my final answer to come out negative, which means my larger factor has to take on the negative sign. A negative 5 and a positive 2 will give me a negative 3. So my 5 needs to go with the negative sign, and my 2 goes with the positive. But let's FOIL it out. Again, if you pick the wrong factors and FOIL it out, and it does not come up with this, you know you have to change it. Okay? So FOILing it out, first, x squared. Outside, x times a negative 5, negative 5x. Watch your signs. Inside, positive 2 times x, positive 2x. Last, positive 2 times negative 5, negative 10. Combining your x terms, negative 5 and a positive 2 is a negative 3x plus 10. That does check, which means that is your factors.